Alexandre Duvernoy stood in the doorway of the mansion, unable to move. From deep within the house came the smell of stewed meat. From the garden, the laughter of children, and on the table in the hallway, where just 6 months ago there had only been a layer of dust, stood a vase with freshly cut peonies. He had taken this road by chance, due to a traffic jam on the highway, and was supposed to just pass by the abandoned family estate, as he had done dozens of times before. But the windows of the house glowed with a warm, lively light, and the house he had given to a barely familiar woman as compensation for someone else's mistake turned out to be completely different from what it had been 6 months ago. Good day, friends! Please write in the comments where in the world you are watching this video from. Don't forget to subscribe and support the video with a like. This story took place in the south of France, in Provence, among lavender fields and old stone houses, where time flows more slowly than in big cities. It is a story about a woman who was unjustly deprived of her job one day, about a house that stood forgotten for 30 years, and about how one noble impulse can change not only someone else's life, but also one's own. Céline Martin turned 57. She was short, just over 1.60 meters, with gray hair that she had long stopped dyeing because she saw no point in it, and with hands roughened from many years of physical work, yet still quick and nimble. Her eyes were gray-green, calm, with that special tired softness that appears in people who have lived a hard life and decided not to become bitter. She wore a short haircut. It was more practical for work, and almost never used cosmetics, except on Sundays when she went to Mass. Céline was born in Auvergne, in a small town near Clermont-Ferrand, in a family where her father worked at a tire factory and her mother sewed at home. She studied well, dreamed of becoming a primary school teacher, and even managed to study for a year at a teacher training college in Lyon. But then she met Mathieu, a tall, cheerful guy from the construction site who could fix anything in the world and make her laugh until she cried. And life took a different direction. They got married when Céline was 23, moved to Paris, where Mathieu found work as a foreman on large construction sites, and Céline got a job at a small bakery on Rue Mouchoir in the 15th arrondissement. And she was quite satisfied that she hadn't become a teacher. She had a husband whom she loved, and a few years later, 2 children, Thomas and Pauline. They lived modestly but happily in a 2-room apartment in Créteil, an eastern suburb of Paris, with windows overlooking a gray industrial area, but with a shared courtyard where the children played ball and neighbors brought out chairs in the evenings to chat. Mathieu earned a decent income for their circle, about 2,300 euros a month, and it was enough to get by, although they could hardly save anything. When Thomas was 11 and Pauline was 9, Mathieu died. A construction scaffold collapsed at a site in Neuilly-sur-Seine, where he had been working as a foreman for 3 months. It happened on a Thursday at 2:30 in the afternoon, and Céline learned about it from the site manager, who came to her home in person because he couldn't bring himself to say it over the phone. She was 38 years old. After the funeral, when relatives had gone home and neighbors stopped bringing food in the evenings, only the silence of the apartment remained, along with a rent debt of 350 euros for 2 months that needed to be paid within a week, or the landlord threatened to start eviction proceedings. Céline remembers that evening in detail. She sat in the kitchen with a calculator and a list of expenses, and the numbers just wouldn't add up, no matter how many times she counted. She found a job 2 weeks later, getting hired by a cleaning company called Groupe Assistance, which serviced office buildings in the La Défense business district. They took her on the night shift, the only vacancy available, because during the day she had to pick up the children from school, and at night, a neighbor, Madame Robert, a widow from the 4th floor, watched them for a small fee and a jar of homemade jam on weekends. The first years were the hardest. Céline worked from 11 in the evening until 7 in the morning, slept for 4 hours, then prepared breakfast for the children, sent them off to school, slept for a couple more hours, and then went back to work in the evening. She remembers that time without self-pity, just as a period that had to be endured because there was no other way. She recalls how, during the winter of that first year, they lacked money for heating, and she and the children slept together in one room, under 2 blankets to stay warmer. She remembers how Thomas, who was 12 at the time, once went to the laundromat after school by himself to wash the laundry because he saw that his mother was exhausted and didn't want her to do it at night after coming home from work. She remembers how Pauline, at 10 years old, started keeping a notebook of expenses, mimicking a habit she had seen in her mother, not because anyone asked her to, but because children quickly learn to notice what is important to the adults around them. Madame Robert, the neighbor who helped with the children at night, refused to accept money for the first 6 months, agreeing only to a jar of jam or a homemade pie on Sundays. When Céline once insisted on giving her a small payment, Madame Robert told her something that Céline remembered for the rest of her life: that help given out of politeness loses half its meaning, while help given because it is the right thing to do does not need compensation, and that someday Céline would be able to pass this on to someone else who found themselves in a similar situation. At that time, Céline had no idea that these words would come back to her nearly 2 decades later, in the basement of an old estate in Provence. There was hardly any free time, but on Sundays, if she could manage it, Céline took the children to the floral park in Créteil, and this became their little family tradition: an hour or two on a bench while the children ran between the trees, and she could finally sit still and do nothing. It was during those moments, watching the children on the playground, that she began to think again, for the first time in a long while, not just about how to make it to the end of the week, but about what she wanted her life to look like many years down the line, a thought she had shelved away because, for now, she just needed to survive. 3 years later, Group Assistants secured a contract to service the headquarters of the Duvernoy Group, a large French conglomerate with interests in real estate, insurance, and logistics, whose headquarters was located in the Tour Premiere, one of the tallest buildings in the La Défense complex, on the 32nd floor where the CEO's office was situated. Céline was transferred there, and she spent the next 19 years of her life cleaning the offices of that building. During those years, much changed. She witnessed department heads come and go, each convinced they would stay for a long time. She saw the conference rooms on the upper floors being updated, while the storage rooms and utility spaces on the technical floors remained exactly as they were on her first day of work. She witnessed economic crises, layoffs, and restructurings, all the trials that large companies go through as the world around them changes while they try to hold their ground. What remained unchanged was how Céline performed her job. She arrived on time. She did everything with the attention to detail characteristic of those who know that what they do matters, even if no one notices. She remembered her colleagues' children's names, knew who was having a bad day before they had a chance to say anything, and left little cards in the break room on birthdays. Small gestures that seem insignificant on their own, but over the years create a type of presence that is immediately missed when it is gone. The night shift security guards, technicians, and some of the managers who had learned over time to understand who really kept the building running, all of them treated Céline with that special, strong attachment that forms over the years and is never explicitly declared. 8 months ago, a new administrative director named Renard joined the company. Claire Renard, 36 years old, with an impressive resume and a management style that made it clear from her first day who was in charge and how things were going to be. She was smart and hardworking, no one could deny that. But she had the tendency typical of those who rise quickly in their careers to confuse the exercise of power with its display, and a belief that respect is built on distance rather than action. Between Céline and Claire, there was tension from the very beginning that was difficult to articulate in specific complaints, but it was felt by all the staff observing both women. It was the tension between someone who has known how the building truly operates for 19 years and someone who has been trying for 8 months to prove that power now belongs to her. On a Monday in mid-October, Claire Renard summoned Céline to her office. Céline arrived with the calmness of someone who has nothing to hide, and therefore, no reason to be nervous. Claire informed her that during an inventory of the storage room containing office and cleaning supplies, several expensive items were found to be missing: a shipment of luxury guest meeting sets that had been ordered for hosting important partners, and that the surveillance camera footage showed Céline present in the storage area at the relevant times, along with testimonies from employees who claimed to have seen her with unusually large bags. Céline listened with the expression of someone being told things about themselves that they do not recognize because they never happened. She tried to explain that access to the storage room was part of her duties, that the large bags were needed for transporting cleaning supplies and consumables between floors. That had always been the case for all 19 years, and that no one had ever questioned her honesty because there was not the slightest reason to do so. Claire replied that the company could not take the risk of keeping someone in place against whom there were reasonable suspicions. That same day, in the presence of 2 HR employees called in for the sake of formality, Céline was fired. She left the building with her personal belongings in a cardboard box handed to her by the security guard. As she herself hadn't thought to bring anything suitable, she hadn't anticipated that it would be necessary. The news of Céline's unjust dismissal spread through the building with the speed at which such things circulate when the affected person has worked long enough for many to know them and intuitively understand that the accusations against them do not match who they truly are. Several employees approached their supervisors. Some filed official complaints, which the HR department reviewed with the usual leisurely pace of structures uninterested in quickly resolving issues that create additional work. One employee, a building maintenance technician named Mark Aubry, who had worked at the company for 12 years and had known Céline since before her children started their own families, took a different approach. He went straight to the CEO's office. Alexandre Duvernoy was 44 years old. He had led the company for 12 years, since he took it over from his father during a rather difficult transitional period for the family. He was a man accustomed to making large decisions quickly and maintaining calm in uncertain conditions, a quality developed over years of practice. What he may have lost over time as he climbed higher up the management ladder was a certain sensitivity to what was happening at levels significantly lower than where major decisions were made. Mark entered his office without an appointment, something that practically no one dared to do, and in 3 minutes told him what had happened with Céline Martin, who she was to the people working in the building, and what he himself thought about the decision made. Alexandre listened to him in silence, then asked for the case materials. What he found in them completely matched Mark's account. An accusation based on indirect and, in essence, insufficient evidence for even a minimally serious investigation. An accusation against a person with 19 years of impeccable service. A decision made with the speed of someone wanting to quickly deal with a problem rather than someone wanting to thoroughly understand it. That same evening, Alexandre called Claire Renard to his office. The conversation was short and unpleasant for both, though for different reasons. Claire left his office fully aware that she had acted hastily and that this would have consequences for her position in the company. Alexandre, on the other hand, emerged with the heavy feeling of someone who had just discovered that something that should not have happened in his own organization had indeed occurred, and that he had known nothing about it until someone had come up to the 32nd floor without an appointment to tell him directly. The damage caused to Céline Martin could not be repaired with just a proposal to return to work, although such a proposal had been made. A 19-year reputation had been undermined. There was the humiliation experienced in front of those who knew her. There was something more difficult to measure than a few lost days of salary. Alexandre pondered how to compensate for such a thing with the honesty that acknowledges, some things cannot be fully fixed, but that is no reason not to try. The Bauzin estate had been in the Duvernoy family for 3 generations. It was located a 40-minute drive from Aix-en-Provence, on the outskirts of the small commune of Bonneau, one of the most picturesque villages in the Luberon region, among hills planted with vineyards and lavender, surrounded by 2.5 hectares of land that had once been a well-tended garden, but had, over time, turned into a semblance of a wild yet beautiful forest. It was a stone building from the late 19th century, 2 stories high, with a basement capable of accommodating several families, if anyone had wanted to inhabit it, which no one had done since Alexandre's mother passed away 11 years ago. For him, the house had long become an administrative burden, requiring maintenance costs and providing nothing in return. He had put the estate up for sale twice in recent years, and both times the deal fell through due to legal complexities related to the land's status, which the lawyers had partially, but not completely resolved. Essentially, it was an unresolved issue from the category of things that are dealt with when there's time. And time, as is well known, is almost never in sufficient supply. There was a logic to the idea of gifting this estate to Céline Martin that Alexandre could not fully articulate in words, but he felt it was the right thing to do. It was not just financial compensation, it was an acknowledgement. It was a gesture of a scale that would correspond to the damage done. At the same time, the form this gesture took, that of real estate, meant nothing to Alexandre emotionally. He had not thought of the house with any attachment for years. He personally went to see Céline. She lived in a 2-room apartment in Créteil, on the 5th floor of a building with an alarmingly creaky elevator, with one window facing the street and another overlooking the courtyard. Céline received him with the expression of someone not expecting visitors and trying not to show it when a visit does occur. She offered coffee. Alexandre accepted. They sat in a small, impeccably clean kitchen, where a plant of the healthy kind that thrives under regular and knowledgeable care stood on the windowsill. Alexandre said that what had happened was unfair, that a serious mistake had been made in the procedure that should not have occurred, that he regretted it and wanted to rectify the situation to the best of his ability. He spoke about the estate in Bagnols, described its current state, large and in need of repairs, and said that it belonged to her if she wanted it. She could sell it and use the money as startup capital for a new chapter in her life, or dispose of it however she deemed necessary. Céline listened with the cautious attention of someone who is unsure if they fully understand what they are hearing. She asked if this was a loan. Alexandre replied that no, it was a gift, and the documents would be drawn up in her name without any conditions. Céline did not respond immediately. For a while, she looked at her coffee cup, then said she would think about it. Alexandre nodded and left. Céline pondered for 3 days. She called her children, who were now grown with their own lives, and told them about the offer. Her eldest son, Thomas, who worked as an electrical engineer in Crete, advised her to sell the house and buy something closer to him. Her youngest daughter, Pauline, who lived in Marseille with her partner and 2 children, said she would support any decision she made. On Saturday morning, Céline went to see the estate in Marc Aubry's car, who had offered to drive her because he had a license, and because he was one of those people who, when someone needs something specific, offers concrete help instead of vague words. What they saw upon arrival completely matched Alexandre's description. A large, dilapidated property with boarded-up windows and a garden that had grown wild over the years. The structure of the house remained sturdy. This was important. The stone walls were intact. The roof needed attention, but not immediate replacement. Inside, it smelled of mustiness and stopped time. Furniture covered with white sheets that dust had turned gray. Rooms with that particular sadness of spaces once full of life and long since emptied. Céline walked through each room with the methodical attention of someone assessing specific possibilities. She went up to the 2nd floor, down to the basement, counted the windows, estimated the distances between the rooms, looked at the garden from the 2nd floor windows, and then walked through it, with November mud sticking to her shoes, counting how much land there was and in what condition it was. Marc silently followed her, the most helpful way to accompany someone who is thinking. On the way back, Céline was silent for a long time, and then she told Marc that she had an idea. This idea had lived within her since childhood, in a blurred form of a dream that loses clarity over the years without completely disappearing. In her hometown in Auvergne, there was a small day center for elderly people without families, a modest place with limited resources, but with something that struck Céline even at a young age, although she could only articulate it as an adult. It had the feeling of a place where people matter, where the elderly have names and stories, and there is someone who listens to them. Céline's mother worked there for many years, and the girl often went with her after school, absorbing without any special explanation the simple truth. Some people need more than services. They need presence. They need someone to sit beside them and not rush anywhere. Over the years, this image remained deep within Céline's understanding of what the world lacks. But between this image and the real possibility of doing something about it, there always lay an insurmountable distance, the kind that arises when you have 2 children, a cleaner's salary, and a 2-room apartment on the 5th floor. The estate in Bonneau, with its 16 rooms, 2.5 hectares of land, and the stone sturdiness of the 19th century, suddenly made this distance different. Not vanished, but different. In the following week, Céline focused on what she did best. She started with concrete steps, not getting lost in abstractions. She went to the town hall in Bonneau and spoke with a social worker to find out what permits were needed to convert private property for social use. She visited the local medical center and learned about the real need for places for elderly people in the area. She stopped by the parish and talked to the priest, who had a special understanding of the families in the region, having listened for years to what people no longer shared with anyone else. Everything she learned confirmed that the need was real, and the existing supply was insufficient. Work on the estate began on the first Saturday of December. Céline, Marc, and his wife Aude, who was a nurse and had very clear ideas about what a space suitable for elderly people should be like. Then a neighbor from Bonneau joined in, having learned through the local butcher that someone was taking care of the abandoned estate. Next came a retiree from the village, a former stonemason, who said he had no better way to spend his Saturdays than sitting at home in front of the television. Then 2 students joined, fulfilling volunteer hours for their university program. The restoration was slow, and without a strict schedule. It couldn't be any other way when resources were limited, and the helping hands had their own commitments and schedules. But it was continuous. Every Saturday, someone would come, most often several people at once. And with each Saturday, the appearance of the estate changed so much that anyone who had seen it in November wouldn't recognize it in February. Céline managed the process in the same way she had overseen her 19 years of work as a cleaner in a 32-story building, with lists, priorities, and the ability to see what needed to be done and do it without waiting for instructions. A skill developed in invisible work, as visible work doesn't always cultivate it. Rooms came back to life one by one. First, the kitchen. Without it, nothing made sense. Then the rooms on the 1st floor, designated for people with limited mobility. Next came the common areas, a spacious living room with windows overlooking the garden, a dining room, and a small room that Céline decided to turn into a library, even though at that moment it housed only 4 books donated by different people. A 73-year-old man named Henry IV took care of the garden. He appeared one January morning and said he had heard that someone was needed who understood plants, and that he did. No one had called for him. He came because he wanted to, and because he had the necessary hands and knowledge. And because Henry, who had lived alone in the village for 5 years, in a life that had gradually emptied of activities, needed a place to go that mattered. Henry became the first resident, unplanned, as things often happen that gain meaning. One day they are there, and no one remembers exactly when they began, because it seems like it has always been that way. One evening, Céline asked if he would like to stay for dinner because she had cooked more than she could eat alone. Then she asked if he would like to stay the night because the road back to the village was inconvenient on a winter night. After that, there was no specific reason for him to leave. The second resident was a woman named Madeleine Garnier, 79 years old, who arrived in March at the suggestion of the same social worker from the town hall who had heard about what Céline was building and thought of Madeleine, who had been living alone in a village apartment since her only daughter emigrated to Germany 6 years ago, and of the loneliness that is hard to describe in medical terms, but which the social worker recognized at first glance because he had seen it many times and knew the harm it caused. Madeleine arrived with a small suitcase and a reasonable skepticism of someone who had learned not to expect too much from new places. During the first week, she hardly spoke. In the second, she began to communicate a bit more. By the 3rd week, she told Henri, the only one who had spent enough time in the house to explain to her how everything worked, that it seemed like a good place. Henri replied that yes, it was, and that he himself hadn't believed it at first either. Children appeared in April. This was not part of Céline's original vision, which she primarily saw as a home for the elderly. But the real needs of the community followed their own logic and schedule. One day, the social worker asked if there was room for two brothers who found themselves in a temporary situation of helplessness, for whom there were no available spots in the usual regional centers. Céline replied, "Yes, because there was space, and the brothers needed a place, and the estate was a place." The boys were 9 and 12 years old, named Leo and Gasper. They arrived with the expression typical of children who have learned not to get attached to any place, because places never stay for long. Leo, the younger one, took just 4 days to befriend Henri, who patiently taught him the names of all the plants in the garden, with the special patience of someone who has plenty of time and is in no rush to get to a specific point. Gasper needed more time. It took 3 weeks for him to sufficiently lower his guard and fall asleep on the couch in the large living room, while Céline read nearby in an armchair, a trust that is not declared aloud, but is clearly noticeable when it arises. Alexandre Duvernoy happened to pass by Beaune one June evening. He was not heading there on purpose. He was returning to Aix-en-Provence from a meeting in Avignon and chose an alternative route due to traffic on the highway, and the navigator suggested a longer path, but without delays. The route passed through the commune of Beaune, and as he drove through it, the road circled around the estate's grounds. Alexander would not have noticed the house if it weren't for the light. It was 7 in the evening, and the June sun was still high enough to cast long shadows. The windows of the estate glowed from within with a warm light, not the cold light of an empty building, but the light of a place where someone was busy with something. Laughter could still be heard. Alexander heard it from the car with the window open. The laughter of children, clearly mixed with a deeper voice of an adult, responding to something that provoked another burst of laughter. He stopped, looked at the building from the car for a few moments, then got out. The front door was ajar, not fully open but not locked either. Alexander pushed it. What he saw inside was so different from what he had left here 6 months ago that it took him a moment to orient himself in the space. The walls, once peeling, had been repainted in light tones. The wooden floor of the hallway had been cleaned and waxed to restore some of its original color, taken away by time. On the table stood a vase with fresh flowers, clearly cut that very morning, judging by their condition. From deep within the house came the smell of food cooking, stewed meat, with that aroma that reveals the hand of someone who knows how to cook and has been doing it for a long time. From the garden floated the same laughter he had heard from the road. He stood in the hallway, no one noticed him. Then a woman in an apron came out of the kitchen, and her expression changed when she saw him. It wasn't surprise, it was a calm recognition of someone who had anticipated that this could happen, even if she didn't know exactly when. Céline Martin looked at him for a second, then asked if he would like to have dinner. Everything was almost ready. Alexander needed a moment to respond. He said, "Yes." She showed him the house while the stewed meat finished cooking on the stove, doing so with the naturalness of someone who was showing a place they knew well, because they had built it themselves, not because they had received it already completed. She described each room with the level of detail of someone who had made every decision for a specific reason. What was done first, and why? What was the hardest decision to make? What still remained in the plans? Alexander listened with an attention that grew as they moved from room to room. He saw the living room, where Madeleine was quietly listening to the radio. He saw the dining room with a long table, now accommodating more people than he could have imagined when it was just furniture under sheets. He saw the garden from the second-floor window, where Henri and Leo were doing something with the soil using small tools. Céline told him about everyone. Henri's story, Madeleine's story, the story of the two boys, the process of obtaining permits from the town hall, the volunteers who came on Saturdays, the nurse from the village who visited twice a week because she was asked, and because she herself felt it was worth it. Alexander listened to all of this with the expression of someone receiving information that completely changes their understanding of something important. They all had dinner together at the long table in the dining room. Leo asked 3 questions about Alexander's work, questions much more precise than one would expect from a 9-year-old boy, to which Alexander answered honestly, as he saw no reason to do otherwise. Madeleine said the stew was very tasty. Henri and Alexander talked about the plants in the garden, a conversation in which Henri knew infinitely more, but in which Alexander listened with enough attention for Henri to consider the discussion worthwhile. After dinner, when the others moved to the living room and Céline was washing the dishes in the kitchen, Alexander offered to help. Céline said she knew where everything went, but he could certainly dry. For a while, they washed and dried the dishes in silence. Then Alexander said he wanted to go down to the basement. Céline looked at him for a second. She said there were things down there that were probably more important to him than to her. The estate's basement had been sealed since the 90s for reasons that Alexander did not know for sure, as no one had ever explained to him why. When Céline opened it at the beginning of the restoration work, she found exactly what one usually finds in basements that have been closed for decades: boxes, items, furniture, and the dust that had accumulated over the years. Most of it had no recognizable history, but deep in the basement was a section where the boxes were labeled in the handwriting of someone who had taken care to ensure they could be found later. The handwriting was small, uneven, and used a labeling system indicating that the person who organized all of this was methodical and valued the ability to locate what was needed afterward. Céline opened these boxes with the caution of someone who understands they are uncovering something that does not belong to them, even though no one had forbidden her from doing so. Inside were photographs, letters, small items that held that special significance that things acquire when they are preserved intentionally. Notebooks filled with the same handwriting as the labels, postcards from various places, children's drawings, what remains of people at the moment they created them. In the largest box at the bottom lay a sealed envelope with a red wax seal, on which the name Alexander was written in the same methodical handwriting. Céline left the envelope in the basement, exactly where she found it. She thought about it all the weeks that passed from the moment of discovery to that June evening. Sooner or later, Alexander would come across it himself, and if he didn't, she would find a way to pass the letter to him. But she had a firm inner conviction that it was better to let him find the envelope where it lay, rather than move it to another place. Alexander went down to the basement with the flashlight Céline had given him, as the basement was lit by only one light bulb that didn't reach all the corners. Céline guided him to the section with the labeled boxes and then stayed at the foot of the stairs, giving him space. Alexandre was in the basement for a very long time. Céline didn't know exactly how long, as she didn't look at the clock, but long enough for Madeleine to have gone to bed, and for Henri to have come out of the garden and quietly asked Céline if everything was all right. Céline replied that it was, that he needed to give him time. When Alexander emerged from the basement, he was holding the envelope in his hand, and his face bore the expression of someone who had been in a place where something was stored that he had no idea existed, and now he was carrying it within him, understanding that it would take time to come to terms with it. Céline asked if he wanted some coffee. He replied, yes. They sat in the kitchen, the place where important conversations took place in this house, with cups of coffee and the envelope with the red seal on the table between them. The letter turned out to be from his mother. Céline Duvernoy had died 11 years ago. Alexander was 33 when he lost her, an age when one considers oneself quite an adult, but in reality, it is an age when the loss of a mother wounds in a way that one cannot anticipate, because it is impossible to predict. Hélène, according to Alexander's memories and the stories of those who knew her, was a woman with her own views on how things should be done, views that did not always align with others, but always had a logic that became evident if one took the time to listen. The letter was handwritten in the same methodical handwriting that Alexander recognized from the labels on the boxes, in blue ink that had faded with time, but was still completely legible. It filled 4 pages of thick paper, the kind chosen when one wants what is written to last. Alexander read silently. Céline waited. After finishing, he carefully set the pages down on the table and stared at his coffee cup for a few moments. Then he told Céline that his mother had originally bought the Beauchamps estate with the intention of doing the same thing she had done. She had this plan for years, with budgets, discussions with the city hall. She had to pause it when her husband, Alexander's father, fell ill, and after his death, she no longer had the strength or resources to continue the project alone. In the end, She sealed the basement with all those materials and the letter addressed to her son because she wanted him to know about it, even though she didn't know when she would be able to tell him in person. The letter didn't ask him for anything specific. It stated that the value of any endeavor is measured not only by the balance in the accounts, but also by what it brings to the world with the resources at hand. That there are things that money can accomplish in ways no other tool can, with the same speed and on the same scale. And that she hopes, she is sure, that he knows this, even though sometimes, perhaps, he forgets that knowing something is not the same as acting in accordance with that knowledge. The last sentence of the letter read that she loves him and is proud of him, and that she hopes he finds a way to do something with his abilities that he will be proud of when looking back. Alexandre was silent for a long time. Céline said nothing, as there were things that didn't require words. Then Alexandre asked what the house needed to continue functioning. It wasn't a rhetorical question, but a practical inquiry from someone assessing how he could help with what he had. Céline replied that there was a list. There was always a list. Alexandre said he liked having a list. Céline looked at him for a second, got up, went to the drawer where she kept important papers, and took out a folder. The very one containing the list of what the house needed, broken down into urgent needs, medium-term requirements, and things that would be nice to have but weren't urgent. With all the estimated amounts calculated with a precision that made the numbers meaningful, Alexandre spent some time reviewing the list. He said the figures were realistic. Céline replied that she had help from people who knew how to calculate such things. Alexandre asked if she had thought about creating a fund. Céline said she had thought about it, but the legal process seemed too complicated, and she hadn't yet found anyone who could help her navigate it. Alexandre said he could help with that. He said it with the naturalness of someone offering what he truly could, rather than making a grand gesture in hopes of recognition. Next came the work that has no single moments of impact. It consists of many small, sequential tasks. The legal establishment of the fund, which the lawyers from the Duvernoy group completed at a speed possible only when someone with real authority declares it a priority. The drafting of agreements with the Bonnier City Hall, hiring trained staff for the care that the residents needed, as the goodwill of volunteers was not enough for everything. Adapting the premises to meet accessibility and safety requirements, which are legally mandated for this type of property use. Alexandre began to appear in Bonniere's more often than he could have predicted on that June evening as he got out of the car. Not with the regularity of someone who had made it his main occupation, but with the frequency of someone who had found a place where something was happening that reminded him of what he had lost, without even realizing it. He learned the names of all the residents. He discovered that Madeleine preferred to have someone read aloud to her, even though she could read perfectly well herself, because the voice of another person changes the perception of words in a way she couldn't quite explain, but which felt real to her. He learned that Henri knew about the life cycles of plants in a way that no botany book could teach, because Henri had gained this knowledge over 50 years of practice, and practice contains details that don't make it into books. He found out that Leo asked questions that seemed simple but were not, and he learned how to recognize things that lay right before his eyes but required time to see clearly. That Céline Martin could do something he couldn't. Take what exists and transform it into what is needed. One October Sunday, when the estate's garden took on the special hues of Provençal autumn, and there were enough fallen leaves for Henri, Leo, and Gaspard to be busy raking in different parts of the property, Alexandre told Céline that his mother's letter reminded him of things he knew but had stopped putting into practice. Céline asked, "About what things?" He replied that what the company does matters. It's not just the numbers. It's important what it actually does with the resources and time it has. Céline nodded. Then she said that his mother must have been a very interesting woman. Alexandre agreed, saying that yes, she was, and that sometimes he forgets how interesting she was until something reminds him of it again. Céline said that this happens with important people. You carry them inside you for so long that you stop noticing their weight until something brings them back to the forefront. Alexandre looked at her for a moment and said that the gift was never about the estate itself. Céline replied that she had known that from the very beginning. Then they both looked at the garden, where Henri was gently scolding Leo for mishandling the rakes, and Leo was arguing with the confidence of someone who believes he is right, even though he was not, while Gaspard stood a little aside, pretending not to listen, though he clearly was. It was a garden that 6 months ago had been a thicket, and now it had become a place where life was happening. It had changed not because the land itself had changed, but because people had decided they wanted to be right there. Essentially, that was the only difference that truly mattered. The foundation named after Hélène Duvernoy, as Alexandre suggested, and Céline felt the name was perfectly fitting, was being established throughout the fall and winter with the kind of solidity that comes from things built on real foundations. It was not a quick process. It was the right process. Céline's lists continued to exist because nothing happens on its own without lists. Volunteers kept coming on Saturdays because the reasons that brought them here in the first place had not changed. The estate in Bogno remained a place that was difficult to describe accurately from the outside, but anyone entering understood within moments. A place where people matter in a way that is felt before anyone speaks it aloud. Last spring, the estate officially welcomed 2 more residents, a married couple from a neighboring commune, whose children had long been living abroad and called on major holidays. Madeleine took a kind of mentorship over them, showing them where everything was, just as Henri had done for her a year ago. The circle closed in that natural way that things usually do when they are set up correctly. Not everything went smoothly. One winter, an old heating pipe burst on the second floor, and for 3 weeks, the residents lived in cramped conditions while repairs were being made. Céline hardly slept during that time, managing the logistics of relocation and construction simultaneously. And one evening, she broke down in tears in the kitchen from exhaustion, allowing herself to do so for the first time in a long while in front of Marc, who simply sat beside her in silence, knowing that sometimes the most helpful thing is to let someone experience a difficult moment. That winter, Madeleine and the married couple had to be temporarily moved to the living room, where 3 folding beds were set up, while Leo and Gaspard slept on mattresses in the library for a week, surrounded by the more than 100 books that had been sent by people from all over the region, who learned about the house through word of mouth. Henri hardly left the house during those weeks. He fixed everything he could repair himself to avoid spending money on professionals that had been set aside for other needs, and in the evenings, he told the children stories about his youth to distract them from the inconveniences. The Bogno Town Hall allocated a small emergency grant for the pipe repair after learning about the situation from the local priest. According to the official processing the documents, it was the first such case in her practice where assistance was approved in 2 days instead of the usual several weeks because, as she said, the whole village was already aware and everyone cared. When the pipe was finally repaired and life returned to normal, Céline hung a small, handmade sign in the kitchen with a list of things to check every fall before winter, to avoid repeating that story. Madeleine joked that now the house was insured not only against the cold, but also against Céline's forgetfulness, and it became an inside family joke that they recalled every November since then. Céline Martin never left the estate to live elsewhere, even though she formally had that option. She took a small room on the first floor, the one with windows facing the garden, and claims that for her, it is the best room in the house, even though the house itself is much larger than the 5th-floor apartment in Créteil, where she had lived for almost 20 years. Alexandre Duvernoy continued to lead the group of companies with the same competence as before, but with something he had restored for himself, a quality that manifested in his decisions not in terms of numbers, but in terms of what he now asked the numbers, what they produced beyond themselves. His mother would have recognized this. He knew it himself, and ultimately, that was enough. Researchers from the University of Aix-Marseille, studying the phenomenon of social loneliness among the elderly in France, note that nearly 1 in 3 people over the age of 75 lives alone, and that regular cohabitation in mixed-age environments, where older adults live alongside children and younger adults, rather than in isolation, significantly reduces anxiety and depressive states in both groups. Sociologists refer to such models as intergenerational communities of mutual care, and point out that their main strength lies not in specialized care per se, but in the very sense of belonging, the feeling that your presence matters to someone else. Sometimes, to understand this, scientific research is not even necessary. It is enough to find yourself in a home where the lights are on and laughter can be heard. Dear friends, if this story touched you, please share in the comments which moment resonated with you the most. Give a like if you enjoyed the story, and subscribe to the channel if you are not with us yet. Hit the bell so you don't miss new stories. Take care of yourself and those around you. See you soon!